to the July 2015 version of our BCM monthly webinars. We're really delighted that you've joined us. It's summertime. Everything's hot and sweaty here in the BCM studio in Oakview, and probably where you are as well. So we're going to keep it informal and hang loose. We're kind of crowded in here, the three of us. This is Elaine, the newly minted Dr. Elaine Enns on my right, and our special guest, Mauricio Tafur Salgado, who you will be hearing from this evening. So thanks for joining us. We've had a couple of opportunities to interview artists over the years. In fact, earlier this year in January, we had a lovely conversation with Tevin East and Jay Beck, who are on this webinar in Philadelphia right now. We're delighted to have our second artist this year talk to us about his work. And I'm going to throw the mic over to Elaine to introduce Mauricio.
Well, hello, friends. Very nice to have you join us tonight. We are in our 5th year of internships here at Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries, and we've had a dozen or so interns that have come from the United States and then also from Australia. And we are so glad to have Mauricio with us for July, stretching into August. His wife Cindy is also going to join us for a couple of weeks, and it has been such a delight for me to get to know Mauricio just over these last week or so. Chet and Mauricio were hanging out together in Rochester and a few other places earlier, so we are very glad to host him here and have him working with us.
So Mauricio, you have come to us from New York, and you are an artist concentrating on theater. You've been all around the world in your work, particularly trying to make sense of your craft and putting it at the service of the wider struggle for social justice and equity. And perhaps you can kick it off by telling us how you came to tell stories, because I know that's a real central piece of your art.
Yeah, and thank you to the both of you for having me and giving me an opportunity to share with your community. I would offer, you just said that I came by way of New York, but prior to New York, I took some time in Miami, Florida, which is where my parents raised me. I was born in Arlington, Virginia, and ultimately was conceived on the coast of Colombia by my folks on the second floor of a sweaty motel as a vallenato party blasted music through one of the doors. So music and art and culture have been with me since I was in the womb. And that's where my journey with story begins, with my family, my parents. I come from a household of storytellers where we've been telling stories since I was a little kid, a very imaginative space. And one of my first memories of telling stories was with my parents in their parenting workshops. My parents are missionaries, were missionaries with the Archdiocese of Miami for a long time before they went on to start their own nonprofit called En Familia that services Deep South Dade, Miami, Florida, which is Homestead and Florida City and Naranja and South Ridge, some of the more rural areas on the outskirts of Miami-Dade County. And one of the main services they've been providing for now 40 years is parenting and marriage workshops. And as a kid growing up in that setting, and as my parents would go to teach these workshops in churches, they would bring me along because I didn't have a babysitter. They couldn't afford one. And they'd put me to work helping them tell the story of a dysfunctional family. You see, in those settings, it's difficult to speak to a group of people who haven't spent much time in educational spaces with an aggressive speaker and a passive audience. So they had to engage them with story, with interactive role play. So my mother would come in the room hollering, ay, it's been such a hot day, ay, es que no puedo más. And she'd be dragging me along, and I'd be whimpering, and Mom, I'm hungry, and so on and so forth. And then my dad would come in and holler something like, Mujer, where's my food? And they'd get into an argument. And at some point, my mom would pause the story right at the climax and would turn to the women and say, okay, mujeres, how do we put up with a man like this and a child like this? And the women would laugh. And then they'd offer some suggestions. And then my dad would be like, wait a minute, men. What are we supposed to do with a woman like this and a child like this? And the men would stay quiet, right? Because they didn't want to get in trouble. And then my dad would poke and prod until they said something. And then my mother would turn to me and she'd be like, Mijo, and you? And how does this make you feel? And at which point the audience kind of took a gasp or laughed because they weren't expecting the kid to say anything, right? Because our parents aren't used to considering their children and their stories. And at that point, I would say what I had rehearsed, which was something along the lines of, it feels bad. And then I would oftentimes improvise and go into a diatribe of why it feels bad and how bad my mom and my dad are, and they would have to deal with my improvisation and giggle embarrassedly about it. But that was my first encounter with telling story with and along my family, and seeing the real power of story to engage an audience in their own personal space in a way that forced them to think about themselves without demanding that they share their story outright and be held to account immediately. So that was one way of encountering story. Another way of encountering story was in school. Unfortunately, when I was growing up in the Miami-Dade County public school system, our schools were problematic and unsafe. And in order to find a good school, a better place to be, I was enrolled in a magnet program. Magnet programs are familiar across the country, but for those who don't know, they are specialized schools that receive funding to provide certain programming, specialized programming for kids in different areas. So I went to magnet theater schools, performing arts schools. There are magnet business schools. There are magnet science schools, etc. And I was in the theater program. And so I did theater in school because it was safe, because it was a safe space to be in for a Latino kid who couldn't afford going to private school. And growing up doing that, in order to stay in magnet schools, I had to stay good at telling stories in that kind of setting. But really what I wanted to do was be a parent. I wanted to be a father. I wanted to get married. So since I was like 12, I've been asking girls to marry me. And eventually, telling story that way, I had the opportunity. My drama teacher invited me to go to audition at Juilliard and to a handful of other drama schools, which I got into. Now, mind you, here I am with this wonderful opportunity to go to Juilliard and pursue storytelling in a very professional setting, and arguably the best setting in the country to prepare me for the entertainment industry. But at the same time, I learned about theater and storytelling in the church, in these spaces where through my youth group, I got to lead young people through encounters about the resurrection and their own encounters with Christ, and really build experiential moments for them. And so this real question for me of what is the space in which I'm called to tell story, and how can I best tell story? Unfortunately, financially, telling story in the church is not valued. And the culture of the church doesn't value storytelling in and of itself, unless you're going on to be a priest. So I thought about the priesthood. Except that the priest that I thought about mentoring under very quickly within our first couple meetings told me that if you're going to be a priest, you have to negate your love of women. And you have to recognize that women are a sin and a temptation that has strayed many men from their vocation. And growing up with my mother, it was impossible to take
Yeah.
that doctrine seriously. Because I lived with a mother who prayed to a Father God and a Mother God, a mother who, in the privacy of our home, countered the patriarchal doctrine that we received at church, with a matriarchal one that encouraged and lifted equitably the right and the role of women in the house and in the community and in the church. So I couldn't go the ministry route. The doctrine and the space that I grew up in, although I loved it and was so social and communal, was repressive to the women that I loved. So I turned to the women in my life, my mother, my aunt, my teacher, my girlfriend at the time, and all of them said, go to Juilliard. There might be something about you entering the entertainment business and telling story in that capacity. And as my mother likes to say, your telling story in that capacity opens a way for other people that look like you. Other people, be it Colombian, be it Latino or brown, however you may look at me and stereotype me, my being there opens the space for more people of that sort to do that.
We had the absolute delight of meeting Mauricio's parents, and I can just imagine them doing this acting and getting people to tell difficult stories and to wrestle with what was happening in their lives. And I so appreciate, your wrestling between doing the ministry and going to Juilliard, but you did choose Juilliard.
I did.
And so can you tell us some of the experiences of being there as a person committed to the church, committed to the faith? What was it like to be working there, studying there?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I didn't, as I mentioned before, my expectations as a child was to be a father, was to be married, was to be a husband. So I didn't think about Juilliard as a stepping stone to a career or fame.
Right.
And then when I got to New York, that was affirmed. The fact that I wasn't going to have an easy go at being famous, because I very quickly learned that 85% of roles in the industry go to white men, and the other 15% go to everybody else, white women, and both men and women of color, which remains true today.
Wow.
That the industry is predominantly led by white men in great majority. And so they're the ones who choose the stories, who write the stories, who act in the stories. And then even if I wanted to be on production staff, they're the ones who are in the production. They're the ones who edit. They're the ones who distribute, right? And so I very easily learned that, although in Miami, right, I am a part of the privileged class, right? I could think of myself as having a career like that of Brad Pitt. When I got to New York, I quickly realized that the best I could do was, was Andy Garcia, right? Which is one very specific story, and that's all that's welcome. The token story of people of color, the August Wilson, the African American playwright, whose stories have to speak for all of African American culture, right? The Nilo Cruz or the Jose Rivera, whose stories have to speak for everybody in Central America and South America and the Caribbean, right? Because that's how this country thinks of diversity. And so, although I was in Juilliard, this great space, and I have classmates who have been tokenized that way now that we've graduated, who are leading very successful careers, the likelihood of my finding success was very quickly diminished. That was one part of my Juilliard experience. And the other part was that my second day there was September 11th of 2001, 18 years old, 2 weeks into living in New York City. And the towers come down. I'm in my first class that morning, and immediately there's a trauma. And in that trauma, one of my teachers gathered the students and offered this. After a handful of hours and moments of real tension and fright and tears and anger, towards the end of the day, our voice teacher gathered the department, all of the students, and offered, listen, for the next couple of days, you are welcome to take the time off to regroup, to process, to consider where you are and whether or not you want to be here at this moment. But here in this space, we want to respond to the destruction that took place out there with creation. Because that is our role as performers, as storytellers, as creators. It is to create, to respond to the destruction. And that landed for me. That propelled me into the work. And in that began a real question of, okay, how do I tell story that creates in order to respond to destruction? Is not just interested in the industry because it is lucrative or can provide me with a platform of power, but is directly responding to the othering that was taking place before September 11th, that led to the acts on September 11th, and that continued after September 11th, all throughout the country, and the obvious immediate action of war that took place in the years to follow. So this real tension for me while at Juilliard of industry, oh, that's really tempting. It's really nice. Potentially I can be a movie star. Who knows? Maybe I can be in Star Wars 27, you know. Like one of my classmates who is right now in Star Wars 7. Or do I think about, do I return to my roots of telling story in spaces that are questioning the social paradigms, that are trying to resist the normative narrative? And from that, and in collaboration with 11 other artists and a couple of faculty, was born what became the next 10 years of my life. Artists striving to end poverty.
So tell us a little bit about ASTEP, and you'll need to prompt me when you want these various slides to come up.
Artists strive. You know what, Ched? Artists striving to end poverty is, I think the story of ASTEP is best with the video that I prepared for you to share. So why don't you share that video?
Chris,
and before you do that, though,
Go
ahead.
I was just going to say that the picture that was on your screen a second ago was that's little me and my little sister Jimena, who had just been born, and my dad. And again, we're playing a game that is full of story, that is full of narrative. A game my father invented of cyclists and a tour that my father imagined. So again, that's the space that I grew up in, a very artistic, imaginative space. But why don't we go to ASTEP and a little bit of that story, and in particular my work through ASTEP.
5, 6, 7, 8. Get up, stand up. Stand up for your rights. What? You don't sound like one. Listen as I can hear. Stop. Stand up, stand up. Snap. Wrist crack. Snap. Snap. Standing acid. He's on the floor and I'm standing over him and I got the gun in my hand now. And I hate guns. I hate holding guns because I'm fat. And asterisk, Batman don't like guns because Batman's parents got ice by guns a long time ago. And asterisk.
Can't stop, addicted to the shindig. Chop, chop, it says I'm gonna win big. Choose not the life of imitation. Distant close into the reservation. Defunct the pistol that you pay for. Dispunk the feeling that you stay for. In time, I want to be your best friend. Eastside love is living on the West End. Knocked out before you better come to. Don't die, you
Artists Driving to End Poverty partners with agencies that are working with children deprived of resources, education, and support. Our goal is to use art to facilitate an environment where a people can share their communal and individual stories, and within that process, find the resources and the support that they're going to need to actualize their potential.
All right, so we're doing a scavenger hunt, and I got little Maria with me, and we're trying to follow everybody with the camera, make sure that we capture everything in the scavenger hunt. Hi, it's Friday, and we're at the end of week 2, scavenger hunt week 2 to be away. Yeah.
When I walk beside her, I am the better man. When I look to leave her, I always stagger back again. Once I built an ivory tower so I could worship from above. When I climbed down to be set free, she took me in again. There's a big hot sun beating on the big people in a big hot world.
So before we begin, we would like to bring up the members of the Infomedia Board to just give some thanks to some of the members of the community which have made this happen.
So it is day, long time has gone by, and we make sandwiches for the kids every day. And this is the sandwich making process, and it happens really late at night, every night, after we've worked with the kids for like many hours. And then done workshops, and then got shopping, and had pizza for dinner for the 100th time. And then met and discussed.
Where I am today is because of you. I'm telling you about the art. I never thought that I would be singing and doing anything because of you guys. You came here and recognized that there was something to me, there was potential to me that I didn't see.
Okay.
So we got week 1 coming to a close. Feeling good about this place, the challenges, and the work ahead. Doing some growing.
Mauricio, say a word about that video, the occasion that produced it.
Yeah, that video was created to show an award giving body. I received an award back in 2008, the Martin E. Siegel Award, for the work that I had done through ASTEP, which really was an award for the entire ASTEP community. From the beginning, it is clear to me, and I've made sure that it is clear in the story, that ASTEP is not my work. It is not the creation of 2 of us, but a body of people. A wonderful moment where a group of students, of 11 students, meet up with a professor who had also had an impetus to start something. And her name was Mary Mitchell Campbell. And between the 11 of us and Mary Mitchell started this work together and really started breathing life into it. And so I received this award in 2008 by Martin Siegel, who is a major philanthropist in New York City. And this montage kind of captured a bit of the work. In that montage, are programs that I led in South Africa, in India, in South Florida, and in New York City. Today, ASTEP also partners with organizations in the Dominican Republic, as well as the Philippines. And we provide a conference for young artists between 18 and 25 called the Artists as Citizen Conference that takes place in New York City at the Juilliard School for a week to bring other young artists like ourselves to a table to discuss and dream and consider and analyze what the challenges are and how we as artists can and should be responding. So the work has grown since that moment in 2008, and very excited to see what's coming of that. But you know, to land a little more detail, the title of the organization, Artists Striving to End Poverty, I think the acronym suits it well. It is ASTEP. The idea that, you know, poverty, ending poverty is a step at a time. And then whenever I come into a room and I offer the name of the organization, the first question that comes up is, well, what is poverty? How do artists do that? Sometimes I get the question, so are you guys just trying to save yourself, artists in poverty? To the which I engage them in a conversation. I say, okay, so what is poverty? And I typically start this conversation, whether it be in college settings when I'm teaching at different universities, or with some of our partners in different settings, with this definition. This is the standard definition that if you Google, you will come across, which breaks down into three: that poverty is the state of being extremely poor, the state of being inferior in quality or insufficient in amount, and the renunciation of the right to individual ownership of property as part of a religious vow. Now, I bring this back to the two of you, Ched and Elaine. What would you add to this? What do you think is missing from this definition?
You know, some of the work that we do in restorative justice, we look at how social power is distributed in the United States. And so we look at different indices of power: race, class, gender, sexual orientation, attractiveness, all of these different indices of power. And so understand that our ability, the issue of mobility, to move, to be able to move where we want to move. We were just talking about this earlier this afternoon, to be able to enter a store and shop freely and not be followed and not be stereotyped. Access, the ability to get what you need in terms of healthcare, in terms of curb cuts for folks that are in wheelchairs, things like that. Self-determination, the ability to make the decisions that most affect your life, and then influence, the ability to be heard. And so that when I think of folks that are affected by poverty, I also think of social power, how it's distributed, how that is impacting folks, and where the chronic places and communities that are suffering from poverty, and what does social power have to do with that?
To make sure I'm hearing you right, and I'm to make this a little more brief, the social power and how that restricts people's ability to access or to make choices or to develop their own power, influence, etc. And which I think immediately, just looking at this definition, is missing, right? This definition puts the onus on the individual instead of recognizing that there is a social power that is doing this, that is capping, that is bonding an individual or a community to a specific place of being or a state. What would you add to that, Ched?
I think that the typical way of looking at the question of poverty rather dismissively is to one-dimensionalize it as only having to do with economics. Access to food, access to jobs, access to capital. Those are very real, indicators of poverty, but I think the broader definition of social power reminds us that, for one thing, poverty is relative, and you've really seen that in your work around the world. What you see in Miami or in the Bronx is different than what you see in Haiti or South Africa. And it has to do with all of these things, not just economics, but social mobility, decision-making power. It has to do with self-esteem. You certainly work with that a lot in your work. So that poverty, broadly defined, is a condition in which both individuals and sometimes whole communities or whole classes are simply not able to or allowed to access the goods that human beings need to live a fulfilling life. It's not just that they're hungering, although it often includes that. It's not just that they don't have any money. It's the entire quality of life, which is always systemically defined as well as in the immediate circumstances of a community or an individual. So, and this is the kind of stuff that you guys really are dealing with.
You know, a great example of this, Chad, is back in 2007, Cindy and I, Cindy, my partner, we were in South Africa working with the Ubuntu Education Fund, which is a very large, well-known and successful organization in Port Elizabeth on the east coast of South Africa. And we were doing a program in partnership and collaboration with them during their winter recess. And as we got there and we sat with the guidance counselors to talk with them and see what it is that they hoped we would do, which is the structure of our organization, that we partner with organizations and we spend time with them developing our curriculum based on the needs that they express. The guidance counselor told us a little story about the care and support program that they ran with their middle school students. A story of a moment when they were trying to get these kids who had HIV, they were trying to bring them together to provide them some counseling and access to resources like hot food, which is very important for these kids. Most of these kids do not have access to hot food, whether they have HIV or don't. And so as they brought the kids together, after the first couple of sessions, the kids stopped showing up. And the guidance counselors started asking around, why aren't the kids showing up? And the kids were avoiding the guidance counselor. And the guidance counselor finally got some of the kids together and said, hey, what's going on? Why aren't you at least coming to breakfast? We have this hot food for you. And the kids said, well, you know, everybody knows that this is HIV food. And I would rather not eat than be stigmatized as someone with HIV. Which is, as you're mentioning, right, that it isn't just about access to resource, but it's resource as we understand materially. But it is the resource of life, what gives us life, which in most of our circumstances is belonging, is a social belonging. And I bring up this word poverty, and it's a great conversation starter. And from this point where we do an analysis, we then move into our stories with poverty. How have we encountered poverty personally? And recognize that the definition of this word is really code. It's a coded word that misses the point, that has stigmatized a select few, and in this country, a race. Right? The African American community is perceived as poverty, as poor. I have a young man down in North Carolina whom I mentor, who is poor, in poverty by that definition. But being that he's white, does not consider himself poor because he believes he has the ability to climb out of a circumstance. And when we start talking about poor and poverty and what he imagines poor and poverty to be, his first image, as it is for so many of us, are kids with distended bellies in South Africa or in Africa in general, right? These are kids, darker complexion, they're girls, they're starving, right? There's a very specific image of what poverty is. And we start seeing how our meaning is wrapped up in our stories. And so our work begins there with the analysis and then the deconstruction of story. What are the stories? How do we associate poverty in our own lives, in our personal lives? How are we close to it? How have we pushed away from it? How are we scared of it? And our hope is to move these students, as we did with those kids in South Africa with HIV, to get them to embrace that they are not defined by their circumstance, that they are not the sum of their, the parts, their supposed parts. They are so much more than that. And the best way we think to do that is by creating a space for them to engage their imagination. Where is it possible that we can becoming defined as moving from one state to another? Where do we become, but in story? And the saddest moments in my work are when I encounter groups of students and parents who even when we do the work of creating imaginative spaces, which takes time, takes trust and comfort, even then, they can't imagine themselves in any other state than the state that they're in. But that's why we believe that storytelling and art is fundamental to the move from poverty, to the move from this code into a different space, because story is the space of becoming.
One of our listeners says, my son started going to ASTEP summer camps starting the year after they started offering them. So early on, it was an amazing experience for their middle and high school years. That's a lovely testimony.
Yeah, that's Kathleen Pagan. Hi, Kathleen. And her two boys, Manny and Dean, who were with us from the second year through like the 9th year. They really went on a journey with us. And I'll move into a little bit now of what I learned from Manny and Dean. I mean, to speak of Manny very specifically, in our 4th year this is in South Florida in Homestead, we as teachers, we were learning with the community how to do this work, right? We were artists coming from conservatory style programs. And from that point, we had expanded. We weren't just Juilliard students, but we were from many different spaces, some already professional, but nonetheless, we weren't educators. We hadn't been trained in those institutions. So we were really in conversation with the students and with our partnering organizations as to what we should be creating, which I thought was excellent. And at one point we thought, well, we were just starting to work with high school students. What if we welcome, cursing? What if we welcome language that is maybe a little more popular around younger people to bridge this gap and get us to talk in a more common vernacular? And I remember getting up in front of a group and saying something and adding a curse word, and afterwards Manny came up to me and he's like, well, why'd you do that? And I was like, well, we're getting to a space where we're trying to feel comfortable. He's like, but that's not who we want to be. He's like, we get to be something more here. We get to embody what we dream of in this space. We get to rehearse the revolution we're aspiring to in this space. If anything, for 3 weeks, even if we return to the space of compromise and oppression, even in this space, if we keep coming back to it, maybe we find the strength. But we have to embody this thing that we aspire to. Manny, who taught me so much, so many lessons along the way from so many of our students, where we recognized that there were a lot of assumptions that we had entering this work. We assumed that our partners were going to work as hard as we worked. And even that, qualifying that there is a hierarchy of hardness to work, right? So to say that we entered a community saying that we wanted to be on equal footing with our students, but we didn't treat our partners that way. We came in and we demanded time of our partnering organization and resources of our partnering organization and understanding from our partnering organizations without recognizing that we were imposing ourselves on them. And then when we finally came to a curriculum with our partners, like for example, down in South Florida, for them it was about the generation gap and the gender gap between these migrant farm workers and kids who were born in this country, as well as the gap of gender, right? The patriarchy establishes between boys and girls. And that was the agenda that our partners established. But we didn't take the time to ask the parents and the kids whether or not they agreed with that agenda, right? We assume that our partners had the analysis down without really doing our work, our due diligence throughout the community.
Can you just give us an idea of some of the kinds of organizations that you partner with?
Yes, so as I've already described, the organization down in South Florida, En Familia, works with the migrant farm working community in South Florida and more. And then in South Africa, we partner with an organization in Nkosi's Haven, which is a foster community for children with HIV and AIDS. Mind you, when I say foster community, I do not mean that they no longer have parents. They have parents, but their parents do not have the resources to have them in their homes. So they're interacting with their parents. This is just the space that they're living in because there are more resources for them in that space. In India, we work with two organizations. We work with the George Foundation, which of many things provides a boarding school for children of the Dalit caste or the lowest caste. And then in the north, we work with Teach for India, which runs on a similar model to Teach for America and places local professionals in school settings in urban centers. And our artists come in to work alongside them and bring the arts into English and history and other curricula. In the Philippines, we partner with local governments to provide camps, institutes, art institutes for students in high schools. And in the Dominican Republic, we partner with a local organization working with young girls. I said and as if I was done. I'm not done. In New York City, we partner with the IRC, which is the International Rescue Committee, which resettles refugees in different parts of the world, including the United States. And so we provide after-school, out-of-school programming for those kids. We also partner with the Incarnation Children's Center, which is a home for children born with HIV. And then we provide programming for a couple of organizations in the Bronx who provide services for children whose parents are moving through the criminal justice system. So it's a very broad range of services. And that is our hope. We recognize that the arts are needed in all of these spaces. And that we can build a relationship with each partner to establish the kind of work that is specific and unique to address the issues of each one of those spaces.
Jay and Tevin are pretty excited about the phrase "rehearse the revolution." You want to unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, rehearse the revolution comes from Augusto Boal and Theater of the Oppressed. Augusto Boal, who establishes a great analysis about theater and art as having been historically used to subvert the revolutionary spirit, to numb revolution, beginning with Aristotle, who was using the theater and catharsis as a way of submissing the polity, the masses. And then moving on through Aristotle, which really is a tradition that we live with today. Our films, our television, our theater, we continue to elevate the exceptional, right? And go on a journey with the exceptional, whatever journey that may be, so that we no longer have to journey, we the mass, we the ordinary, have to think or do anything because the exceptional have done it for us. This is why our televisions and our films are primarily stories about law enforcement in this country. That's what dominates our narrative.
Amazing.
Because we are a country about enforcing laws. And whether the exceptional person is the person who's trying to beat the law or the law enforcer, either way, we're trying to keep law enforcement at the center of the discussion. And most of the time romanticizing what it is to hold a gun, right? So that is the mainstream use of art, the predominant use of art. All along the way, there have been aesthetics of resistance, artists that have sought to resist and push back against the state and the dominant artistic movement. Augusto Boal being one that came out of the 60s in Brazil, and that really has extended itself across the world. An artist, a Theater of the Oppressed practitioner that I'm connected with, was just spending some time in the Ukraine amongst the revolutionaries within the protest, working with them in a forum theater setting, trying to get them to think through how it is that they were going to take their next action through role play and be real practical and specific about the elements of power and what kind of subversive action they could take by rehearsing it, by playing it out through drama. And that's just one. Theater of the Oppressed is just one medium, one way of rehearsing revolution. But I think that's what we all have to come to recognize, is the reason that in this country we think of art as entertainment is because the power of art has been co-opted by the state to entertain us, to subdue us, to numb us, so that we come home and escape to our television sets and to our films. And so that we forget that art has the power to shake us up, to enrage us, to fire up the revolutionary spirit, which I think Jay and Tevin are doing with the Carnival de Resistance, and how they're trying to embody the biblical narrative in order to resist the mainstream narrative of Christianity in this country, which has been so oppressive for everyone.
You've named all of these widely diverse settings where you've gone, ASTEP has gone to do this work. And so one of the questions that comes up for me is, how do you prepare to enter these spaces and hear these stories and encounter people? The phrase that comes up for me is listening them into speech, so they can bring forth their story. How do you do that?
Yeah. I think the first thing that I do is I reconnect with my own story. And I remember my own lament. Henry Nouwen, the Catholic mystic and theologian, understands lament as equivalent to the word care, which comes from the Gothic cara, as it says here. The basic meaning of care is to grieve, to experience sorrow, to cry out with. I am very much struck by this background of the word care, because we tend to look at caring as an attitude of the strong towards the weak, of the powerful toward the powerless, of the haves toward the have-nots. And in fact, we feel quite uncomfortable with an invitation to enter into someone's pain before doing something with it. Instead, the friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair and confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness. This is the friend who cares. That is, to me, the work. And in order to be able to do that, it took me some time. What it took me was recognizing that I needed to care, was owning my own lamentation. That my lamentation begins when I was 6 years old, and the traumatic moment of my grandfather beginning to sexually abuse me. The traumatic moment when my uncle, in search of my mother, called my house. My mother wasn't home. And he says to me, "Mauricio, I can't do this anymore. Will you please tell the family I love them?" And as he's weeping, admitting that he's going to commit suicide, I'm weeping with him, trying to tell him, no, please, don't do it. No, please, what can I do? And he says, "I'm sorry," and hangs up the phone. I am that kid. I am still that kid lamenting on the other side of that telephone. Lamenting to whomever is on that other side, my uncle, my aunts, my grandfather, my kids, all of the people who are out there crying out and don't know where to go. And realizing that what I need most is this kind of care. Is someone who can sit with me instead of try to provide answers and tell me that I am dysfunctional, or that I am disabled, that my trauma makes me strange, right? Or that my trauma dislocates me, alienates me from my community, which happens to so many of my students. They have been alienated from their bodies, from their communities, from their planetary body, and from their history. And where do we begin? Where do we begin to create space to heal the trauma? Is by creating space, by lamenting with them. And that's, aside from taking time learning, it's also practice in the skill of learning how to listen reflectively, in practice with other artists. I do this, I role play these scenarios precisely with other artists, so we get it, we get in the habit. We break the social normalization of fixing problems, right? By learning how to sit quietly and listen and be with and cry with and open ourselves and open our bodies to another person's experience. And then hopefully together in time, God can come through the both of us and find a way to reveal something new.
This notion of caring, as you're describing it, as Nouwen describes it, I think immediately of the movement of the 1980s of acompañamiento, in which refugee communities, people who had been displaced by war and by injustice, folks who were trying to figure out how to live in solidarity with these people realized that often all you can do is just accompany and just be with folks as they're going through this trauma, whether that's in a refugee camp or moving from place to place or attending to the felt needs, and that's kind of a political corollary, I guess, to what you're talking about in the work that you've explored in ASTEP. And it always struck me that was a particularly profound and mature realization among the solidarity movement, that sometimes all you can do is just accompany somebody, and that actually makes space for other things to happen.
That's it. And talk about countercultural. Making space to accompany is to put aside my agenda, my own desires, my own ambitions, my own career. It is decentralizing myself to centralize us as community, to move towards a space where we exist, us exists, instead of I and you. It becomes I and I together. And that's one of the hardest things for me. And I feel it every time. I've been feeling it since I was a child, going about the streets of Miami and encountering people who were asking for help and moving by them, right? And it's not just the moving by them, it's the intentionally ignoring, because again, my central focus is my own journey. But to decentralize myself, that's not to say that I do not recognize that I'm also a part of this, but it is to re-centralize us, we as community. Then to expand the us to the planet, to expand the us to our history, to those who came before us, right? So that we're really thinking about our bodies, not just in the here and the now temporally, but historically, planetarily as well. I think that then we begin to deconstruct this era of disposability that we live in, where both people and resources, everything is disposable, where there is a hierarchy of values that elevates the exceptional and does not allow room for the ordinary.
Just a quick note, those of you wanting to be exposed to a little bit more of Mauricio's repertoire, he gave a TEDx youth talk or performance that is available online, and perhaps Chris, you can chase out that link and type it into the chat box. It was that URL was on the registration page for this webinar, but in that performance you talk about having to encounter the other in that kind of way that you're talking about. I thought that was a really nice piece.
Yeah, a beautiful piece that was a medley of stories from the students that I've worked with over the years, because every story has now become a part of my story. And it was important for us to share their story. They demand of me to share their stories with our community. That's what it is to lament. It's not alone to sit with, but then it becomes to take the story out, to share the story with others, which is a big part of what I tell the artists that volunteer with ASTEP, is that, yes, we are hoping to create space that transforms, that creates transformation. But let's recognize, first and foremost, the transformation that you yourself are going through. And then what that transformation demands of you when you return to your home, to your place. Now you are no longer alone, but you are also walking with and carrying the story and the legacy of the children that you've been working with. And so to lament becomes to cry out, precisely as Henry Nouwen suggests. And we must cry out.
Can we ask you to tell one of those stories, the stories that you're carrying of those children that you have worked with?
I think an excellent, a beautiful story that captures what it means to sit with was actually, it's a story of Cindy's. And the first time we were in South Africa, this picture right here, right next to the Henry Nouwen's quote, is a picture of Cindy sitting in a sari at Shanti Bhavan, which is Sanskrit for haven of peace. And this is the boarding school for children of the lowest caste, of the Dalit caste in India, a couple hours outside of Bangalore. And this is the cafeteria, the mess hall, where all the students come to eat, and they sit by grade level at different tables. And we as volunteers are invited at dinner time to sit with the students to hear their stories. Now, Cindy was a bit nervous about this trip in particular because, as Cindy tells it, she grew up in a stable, privileged circumstance where she doesn't remember having a traumatic moment. The closest being an accident that her brother was in, and the ripple effect of that accident. But she was very nervous about coming to this school, knowing a bit about the stories she would encounter. And precisely our second night there, she sits at the table with the 10th grade girls, who were the oldest girls at the time. And as she sits down with her food, one of the girls sitting across from her says to her, "Okay, why don't we go around and tell our most horrible story so that we can get to know each other?" Like that was how they wanted to introduce themselves to one another. And Cindy was the last one around the table. And she's hearing these stories of girls who had been kidnapped, girls who witnessed their mothers being killed, girls who had been raped, girls whose families tried to burn them for being girls, all kinds of horrible circumstances. And as she's going around, she can't breathe because she's so scared. She doesn't know how to lament with these girls because at that point, Cindy had not done the work of recognizing her own trauma, of recognizing her own location, that, as Martin Luther King said it, if there is injustice somewhere, there's injustice everywhere. And if that's true, then all of us are experiencing injustice, whether or not we're blind to it. And so Cindy hadn't done that work. It gets around to her point, and she nervously tells this story about, well, you know, my brother, this happened to him. And that's it. And the girl who had initiated, one of the girls with arguably one of the more traumatic stories, leans across the table and puts her hand on Cindy and says, "I'm so sorry. That must have been so hard." And just sat with her. And the tears started rolling down, right? And it's in that moment that Cindy started that process, that process of learning to care, of, again, decentralizing the way she viewed herself, right? The norm of being a white privileged woman, and realizing that she too had a place. She too had a story. And to have come from this girl who arguably is a person in poverty, who doesn't have, who is the one who should be silent, or is the one who doesn't have the ability to speak. She was the one who could help Cindy begin her journey. Is an excellent moment of many very similar moments. My own moments of coming to my faith. My journey to faith was rooted in the encounters with parents in South Africa, and how they lived through apartheid, and how amidst this intractable oppression, they had hope in God. And they had to have hope, because without hope, they couldn't have gone on existing. And that hope in God helped them persist. That even still in a South Africa post-apartheid, a South Africa that is still deeply bound to its history and struggling to work its way through liberation, these people still are rooted in their faith, in their deep faith in God. That's what gives them the hope to move on. And I, who sometimes struggle to think of hope or to think of God, because, quite frankly, I have enough. I grew up in a household that had enough, so I didn't have to lean on God in that way. I didn't have to lean on a greater authority. I had authority. My parents had authority. Growing up in Miami, where my parents had master's degrees and had their own organization, right? And as a male, a heterosexual male, right, with plenty of privilege, I didn't need a God. And then I got to these circumstances, and I realized the strength and the power of these people. And what was their anchor? But their belief in God. And not just amongst parents, but also amongst the children. Whether or not they fully understood what their belief in God was, the word alone, God. The story of Ruth, right? The story of Ezekiel. These were stories that they knew, albeit they might have not known the full intricacies, but these stories gave them somewhere to go, gave them somewhere to imagine and locate themselves as amongst God's chosen people, the oppressed. To kind of scroll through some of the other pictures I put here of some of the other communities. These are some of our girls down in Homestead, Florida. As I mentioned, these are girls who, of the many that we work with, their families are migrant families, migrating from, be it the Caribbean or Central America or South America. Their parents oftentimes work 12 to 14-hour days. And some of their parents come and go with the crop, so to say, that they travel throughout the country at various seasons. And so, En Familia partners with housing organizations that try to give these families a place to stay, where children and grandparents and aunts and uncles can stay. But oftentimes what that also does is it dislocates family. And that dislocation starts oppressive actions, families start enacting dysfunctionally. And a lot of our girls are raped and physically abused by their loved ones, by the authority figures in their household. And then when they want to turn to somebody, who do they have to turn to when the authority has deemed them illegal, right? And disposable. So it becomes difficult to find a place, a safe place, a place to heal from their traumas. So those are some of our girls in South Florida. The next picture here are some of our girls in New York City. These girls are from Guinea. that were placed in the United States by the IRC, by the International Rescue Committee. And a lot of our students are coming from refugee camps where they've spent their whole lives. Some of them might have spent a couple of years in refugee camps, but most of our kids who are coming between the ages of 2 and 22 have spent the majority of their lives in these liminal spaces, in these neither here nor there, where they're dislocated from a planetary space, which makes it very difficult because these are cultures whose histories are very bound to the land, whose stories and traditions are very much about the land. So then they arrive to New York City, which couldn't be a more dislocated place, a place where more transient stories and transient individuals. And then they hope and try to locate themselves. What do they latch onto? They latch onto popular culture. And so a part of our work is to introduce them to popular culture, to recognize what they already know about popular culture, and then maybe try to question some of the popular culture that they're buying into, because arguably it's that popular culture that led to them being dislocated and alienated, that led them to this refugee status, this popular culture that, again, elevates the exceptional and displaces the rest, the mass. The next picture here are of a group of girls in South Africa. This is an organization we worked with outside of Johannesburg called Refill Way. I had the good fortune of that year of working with these girls. These girls are between the ages of 3 and 7. And I ran a program with another artist, a visual artist, for kids between 2 and 9. For 3 weeks. It was my first time working with that age group. Wow. So I spent a fair amount of time in New York City shadowing elementary school teachers, trying to learn all the tricks of how to manage an elementary school classroom. And then I got there and had to throw all of that out the window. But we had a great time. And what's so beautiful, these are all kids who, again, are orphaned. Their status is orphaned or vulnerable children, OVCs. These are kids whose families cannot afford to house them, or whose families have died because of HIV or AIDS. And this community, Refill Way, is a community. So it's a series of families that have taken these kids in. And yet, even in this circumstance, we're talking about a community that has both Afrikaner and British and Black African, South African families. And they're also struggling, right, with all of their biases. And how do they live together as community and raise these children in these circumstances? So there are many layers here to explore. And what these kids do is they help us explore them. They help us realize them, and they also help us laugh. To ground us in some hope.
Just one of the things that as you're telling these stories, going into these places and helping, children and small children and older children tell their stories, get in touch with the pain, fear, agony, whatever it all is. I think, from a restorative justice perspective, who do you also partner with to carry the work forward and to provide ongoing care? Because if a child does get in touch with all of that trauma, pain, that is a long journey.
Sure. And I want to take a moment to check something I've said, which I think I've heard you echo, which is the word help. To enter a community and to help people tell their story. They have the capacity to tell their story.
Right.
If anything, what we do is we provide space. We help our partnering organization recognize that their kids need space.
Right.
And so by our being there, by our presence alone, what we're doing is we're just creating some space, and then the kids within that space tell their story. And we facilitate in our playful way, but again, recognizing that our aesthetic is in large part a part of this Aristotelian tradition, right? So we also have to do a hard work of checking our own aesthetic, and how we try to frame art, how we allow them to tell it within their own genres. So just to take a moment to check this language of help.
Yeah, absolutely.
But to answer your question, the process of partnering with an organization is an extensive one. We spend some time on site doing a needs assessment where we get to know the organization before we do work with the students. And we get to know what their history has been and what kind of work they're doing in the community, what kind of services they provide, what kind of space they can make, precisely because we have learned from mistakes. We have learned from coming and stirring the pot, and then kids afterwards being like, what are you doing? What have you done? And parents and organizations being like, what are you doing? What have you done? So we've learned that that's why the partnership matters so much, and our getting to know what the partner is capable of, and then catering our curriculum to the structure that the partner has created for us. So for example, there are organizations that we've partnered with who don't have access to certain materials, like visual arts. So we can't do visual art programming because their kids won't be able to continue doing visual art. Or there are organizations who don't have counseling staff. So we don't do certain kinds of theater or music that will bring that about in the students. We do other kinds of storytelling so that they come at it from a different point of view. And we try to ensure that through all of the organizations that we partner, that there is ongoing programming for the students, so that the students are consistently engaged, which means, again, that we are but an aspect of the larger work that the partnering organization is doing. Furthermore, it is the partnering organization that is doing the work on site. And we have the good fortune of being there to witness, to lament with, to laugh with these students and create a bit of space that they might be needing. I would say that aside from that, the most important bit of our work is returning. That for as much as we might in the series of 6 weeks or even a year, help a community find a story, again, I said it, right? Create a space for a community to tell a story, to develop an analysis, maybe some action plans. The real work is in returning, is our commitment to say, okay, we're going to come back.
We will be back.
So all of our partnerships, we do our best to commit ourselves to at least 3 years of work on site. And at the moment, the organizations that we're currently partnered with are going on longer than 3 years. And we start to see that, for example, in our longest standing organization, the partnership with the organization down in South Florida, those kids, like Kathleen's kids, like Manny, they went on to become teachers' assistants. And then some of them go on to become teachers of the program. And some of them go on to administrate the program. And this our first year where the majority of the program staff were local students who now claim themselves as artists. So we're beginning to do that of allowing and creating this, allowing the local artists to create that space, to facilitate that space. And I think that's our end goal for all of our sites.
And this is some of your ASTEP crew here?
Yeah, so this was the last project that I was a part of before I transitioned out of ASTEP. This was a project that I did in New York City with LaGuardia Community College and Kingsborough Community College, where we partnered with the theater departments. Because the professors there wanted to do some work around the institution of homelessness in New York City. As of last year's homeless census, we had more than 51,000 people who were going through the institution of homelessness in New York City. And a lot of the kids in our community college system have gone through that system themselves. So what these professors wanted to do was they wanted these students who are thinking about art, are thinking about the potential of art, but are already thinking about art only in entertainment purposes, wanting to help them find another way of thinking about art. So we partnered with these two organizations, with these two schools and 4 organizations in and around New York City to create a 6-week experience where these students in the photo volunteered at these sites, and then we'd come back together to reflect and create stories based on what they experienced. And we created a show, a full-length show that we then shared with the community colleges and in those communities, and witnessed some real transformation amongst those students. And for myself, coming to a place where I realizing that I had to do more work, that I'd spent the last 10 years at the metaphorical end of the river downstream, catching people as they were drowning, but that I needed to spend some time upstream learning about why the people were falling in the river, who was pushing them, and for what reason. That as a service provider, I spent a lot of time responding to poverty, but that it was now time for me to spend time analyzing the structures, the affluence, the capitalism, and naming it that creates the poverty. And starting to find ways to use art for that purpose. And so that's where now in the past year and a half, I transitioned out of ASTEP and spent the last year in seminary at Union Theological Seminary, doing a bit of this analysis, understanding how our Christian narrative has been used to perpetuate oppression and poverty, and hoping to find ways of an aesthetic of resistance. I know that Tevin and Jay are steeped in that at the moment. So I'm now taking that work, these theo-artistic conceptions, and moving them to Brown University, where I will be in residence for the next, who knows, maybe 3 years, exploring these questions and how we can challenge our theater spaces and challenge our artistic norms.
So ASTEP is an organization that you and your partner Cindy founded.
Alongside a group of
alongside
11 artists and Mary
many
Mitchell
others.
Campbell. Yeah.
It is an organization you both stepped away from to continue to deepen your own discipleship, and yet the organization continues its good work.
That's awesome.
What did you learn about justice at Union?
I moved from Matthew 25 to Amos and Micah. I moved from wanting to serve the hungry and the naked, the sick and the homeless and the imprisoned, to crying out why it was, and to holding our society to account. I learned about the trauma in which the Bible was created, a community coming from exile, traumatized by that exile, building a narrative, writing a narrative that would lift them and empower them and sustain them, which is our biblical tradition. I learned from James Cone what it means to be in solidarity, to locate the intersections of oppression, and to name them. Furthermore, to name the demon, right? To name the demons of capitalism, of militarism, of sexism, and to teach that, and to encourage that, and to speak out about that from my own position, as well as to locate myself, to do the work of locating myself, which is work I hadn't done thoroughly enough. And how, even in my own relationship, I was imposing myself on Cindy, assuming that we were standing on equal footing, without recognizing that we are steeped again in this injustice. And I benefit so much from the privileges of being a guy who was raised in a privileged environment, which is Miami. For Latinos, it is a privileged environment. And being a heterosexual male who never dealt with society going, that's wrong, or you're wrong. So that's been the real work of Union. And then coming to an understanding of how, and starting to ask this question, okay, so how does art and theology, how are these things used? I know that they coexist, right? What are our church spaces but performance spaces, but spaces that are asking us to become disciples, right? To perform our discipleship. So how do I find myself in that, and how do I advance as you said, my own discipleship as an artist?
We've got just about 10 more minutes, and at this point, I want to invite, if there's any of our listeners who want to chat in a question to Mauricio, this is a good time to do it. You just opened up the question of church as a performance space. Now, Boal talks about the struggle to move people from being spectators to spec actors, those who see and then actually participate. Our churches are set up, literally configured to promote performance and also to promote spectating. That may be one of the reasons why you're not too sure whether the church can be or how much of an ally the church can be. But do you see any hope for how ecclesial spaces can move from spectating to spec acting?
I think Tevin and Jay are doing that. I think Tevin and Jay and Carnival de Resistance, they are working on creating interactive spaces that allow time for people to share their story, to invoke their own journey, instead of having to follow the program or the narrative of the hierarchy that's already established. I mean, I try to do that in my own work. I try to come into workshops, and the first thing I say is yes, I come in with an agenda, but I'm ripping it up, I'm throwing it out the window, and wherever we want to go, we go. And yet I've had students say to me, yeah, but you're in a school. And yeah, but there's an hour and a half limit to this workshop. Right? So what you're saying here is but lip service. How do we really challenge that? And maybe, to me, there is something to be said about Audre Lorde's comment on, you can't deconstruct the master's house with the master's tools. I'm struggling in that. I have hope because there are other organizations, other artists out there who are challenging our spaces. But I think the role of the artist is the role of the interrupter. And being interrupters, the moment we as artists try to institutionalize, we lose that ability to interrupt. By nature, we should be interrupting spaces. We should be challenging spaces. But the moment we try to centralize and go, okay, now how do we continue this interruption? We move away from being interrupters into something else, into being institutions. And until we do the serious work, and we're not there yet, of really deconstructing the injustice and why the injustice exists, and we all get on board with that, I think art has to remain as a tool of interruption. It has to continue moving here and there, and like the clown, the jester that questions and that pushes everybody on either extreme of the movement. Art's going to continue to get perpetuated as a tool of the state, going to get co-opted by capitalism, which it is so good at doing. Even Boal, even these catchphrases, one of my saddest experiences was seeing Fela Kuti's Broadway show. Fela Kuti, a prolific Nigerian artist who really stood for the movement in the 60s and 70s and the 80s, and to see it become a Broadway spectacle where his catchphrases were put on T-shirts and sold for $30, right? It's the Bob Marley icon. That's what capitalism does. The moment that art wants to go, yeah, but we want a little more, let us stand stable, be a little more stable, I think we lose our potency.
The ability to commodify instantly artistic expression or even disruption. Whether it's hip hop or the Occupy movement. So that brings us back to your discipleship. You had your shot, man, at Juilliard. You could have been a contender.
Right.
You make a choice to put your vocation at the service of marginalized people. Not a great career move in the industry. You've tested seminary for a year. You found that rich, but it also helped you clarify that you wanted to take another shot now at what it means to be doing this professionally. So you're going to Brown. Have you committed professional suicide? Will you feel tempted to be drawn back into the industry at Brown? Do you think that space can be a place where you deepen your vocation of putting your craft at the service of marginalized people and the struggle for justice?
It's a great question, and you framed it how my teachers there framed it, right? To tell that story a bit, the folks that run the program the directing program at Brown, Brian and Melissa, are old friends of mine. I've been doing a lot of work with them for the last 13 years, and they are theatrical interrupters. They are deconstructionalists. They come from that tradition. And so it's one of the reasons I'm going there, because I recognize that they have that aesthetic. At the same time, they've told me, right, Mauricio, but you are going to become a professional director. And what I've had to do is clarify for them, no, that's not why I'm here. I'm here to decolonize our stories. I'm coming here to find the voices of the people that are missing in our stories. And when I said that, that sounded very nice and catchy, and some of the students responded very well, right? But I immediately sensed the co-optation, right? Oh, great. We have the Latino kid who's kind of spicy, who's going to come in here and he's going to do some plays, but he's going to do it within our structure. So I wrote them and I said, let me be clear what I mean by decolonized stories. I mean that our stories are colonized, which means that your institution is a colonial institution, which means that your institution continues to perpetuate the sexism and the racism and the militarism that is part of the colonial project. And I'm here to challenge that. And then I got a phone call, right? And then the real dialogue started of, okay, what do you mean by that? And how are you going to do that? And how much are you willing to challenge us? And where I'm fortunate, I think, right now is that they've been walking with me for the past 10 years as artists and have seen the work that I've been up to, and they believe in that. They recognize that art has a capacity to resist. They are also entrenched in the industry. So they're going about those motions, but they don't want to be. They want to welcome me into the conversation because I think they too want to be pulled and they too want to be challenged. So I think that's why Brown has the potential of being a space for me to develop my own aesthetic of resistance. It's quite possible that a handful of months into it, that's not what it is. At which point I'm okay to move on. Will I be tempted? I don't know. Maybe. It's obviously temptation is a part of the journey, but I'd like to believe that I carry Manny's story and Dean's story and Jeffrey's story and Vinay's story and Zipo's story and Kavita's story and Kartika's story and so many stories of so many kids that they will keep me honest.
That is a sacred trust.
Yeah.
We're really delighted at the opportunity to have you with us
Thank
for
you.
these weeks out here in California, and we look forward to continuing to learn from you and collaborate with you.
Thank you.
Appreciate you being part of
Yeah, and thank you, for sharing your journey, how this, I'm reminded at the beginning of your story started when you were a little one with your mom and dad and has grown, and what an incredible journey. Thank you for sharing it with us and with our community.
Thank you. And thank you.
As we always do, there will be a recording of this webinar, and we really encourage you to let your friends know about it, particularly people who are interested in these themes. And we will continue to spread the word about both Mauricio's work and also about the experiment in alternative pedagogy represented by these webinars. In that spirit, I want to join with amazing colleague in the next room, Chris White, who quietly does the magic behind this tech. We've been collaborating for the last few weeks on our own experiment to move into a new initiative through our webinar series. So next month's webinar will be the first in a series of what we're calling our Bartimaeus Institute Online bio, in which we are developing a number of self-paced introductory courses on key discipleship themes And these packages will include webinars, both live and previously recorded. They'll include articles and writing, and they'll include video and audio that will allow our constituency to pace themselves, to really drill down on particular issues at their own pace. And we're going to premiere a different theme each of the next 4 months as we move through the second half of the year. So next month will be our first of these. It will be an introduction to radical discipleship. That is a trope that we place at the center of our work here at Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries. What does it mean? What is its history? What is the context? What are the stories? What's the theological framework? That's what we'll be exploring next month on August 18th. We hope that you will join us and really help us launch this new initiative, which will include some of the core themes of our work, such as Sabbath economics, restorative justice, biography as theology. And we're excited to try to make more and more of the resources here available in a way that will help equip our folk in different ways, as we all are on the journey of moving from being spectators of an unjust world into spec-actors who are engaged in transforming that world. And we have a great example here in Mauricio Salgado. We're so appreciative that you've taken time to stop by and talk to us, and that your life and ours can converge in these ways over these weeks. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next month. As always, we rely on your word of mouth and your promotion of these things to try to get folks to see this as a place to engage in these kinds of amazing conversations with these kinds of amazing people. So thanks for joining us. Mauricio, want to say goodbye to the crew?
Gracias y bendiciones.
Elaine?
Thanks for joining us. And I'm loving these messages that are coming through in gratitude for Mauricio. Thank you, friends, for being a part of this evening, and look forward to seeing you again in a month.
And it looks like you've got a standing invitation to join the Carnaval de Resistance from Jay and Taylor.
Awesome.
That's great. Thank you, friends, and we'll see you next month.